The high-pitched wail of the VIP ward's emergency override cut through the sterile silence of the hospital. Inside the obsidian glass suite, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and desperation. On the surgical bed lay Hoon-jung, the most powerful Mafia CEO in the country. His skin ashen and his pulse non-existent. 8 of the finest surgeons in Seoul stood paralyzed, their faces pale beneath their masks. They had spent 12 hours fighting for a man who was already gone. They had used every advanced defibrillator, every experimental stimulant, and every surgical trick known to modern medicine. But the heart monitor remained a flat, unwavering blue line. Science had officially called it. Behind them, Hoon-jung's lead enforcer didn't waste time with grief. The metallic click of a semi-automatic handgun echoed against the medical monitors. He leveled the barrel at the lead surgeon's head, his voice a low, lethal growl. If his heart doesn't beat in 60 seconds, neither does yours. The surgeons closed their eyes, waiting for the end. But then the heavy security doors hissed open. Victoria John didn't stumble, she marched in. She was just a night shift nurse who had been assigned to the general trauma ward, her teal scrubs already stained from a long night of labor. She didn't look at the gun. She didn't look at the doctors. She only looked at the monster on the bed who was cold enough to match the room. The high-tech hum of the VIP suite, which had briefly surged with the triumphant rhythm of a restored heartbeat, suddenly curdled into a discordant whine. Victoria stood by the bedside, her breath hitching as she looked at her hands. They were still humming, a faint golden residual heat vibrating beneath her skin, but the professional mask of the nurse was rapidly being replaced by the raw terror of a woman who had just touched the sun. "I need air," she whispered, her voice cracking. I need to go." She turned toward the double doors, her teal scrubs rustling in the sudden heavy silence of the room. But as she took her 5th step away from the bed, the heart monitor reacted as if she had severed a physical cord. The steady beep, beep, of Hoon-jung's pulse fractured, slowing into a sluggish, agonizing drag. The green line on the screen dipped sharply, trembling toward a flat horizon. "Vitals are crashing," the lead surgeon shouted, his voice a mix of professional panic and sheer, unscientific disbelief. "He's bradying down. 30 beats per minute. 20. We're losing the rhythm." Victoria froze, her hand hovering over the door handle. The moment she stopped moving away, the monitor stabilized. It didn't recover, but it stopped its plummet into death. Confused and trembling, she took another step back toward the exit. Immediately, the alarm shrieked, a long, piercing note of impending cardiac arrest. "Back to the bed," the enforcer roared. The metallic slide of his weapon was the only sound that cut through the electronic scream of the monitors. He didn't just point the gun at the doctors now. He pointed it at Victoria. "Get back to him. Now." Victoria scrambled back to the bedside, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The second her hip brushed the edge of the mattress, Hoon-jung's pulse spiked, surging back into a perfect athletic 60 beats per minute. The room fell into a suffocating, terrified stillness. The lead surgeon stepped forward, his trembling hand holding a tablet that displayed Hoon-jung's live neurological and cardiac data. He looked at Victoria, then at the unconscious mafioso, his eyes wide with a look that bordered on religious awe. "It's a biomagnetic synchronization," he stammered, his scientific mind struggling to categorize the miracle. "His heart. It isn't beating on its own. It's slaving off her proximity. He's biologically tethered to her presence." "What are you saying?" the enforcer demanded, his grip on the gun never wavering. "I'm saying that if she leaves this room he dies," the surgeon replied, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "He is no longer sustained by medicine. He is sustained by her." The enforcer's eyes shifted to Victoria, no longer seeing a nurse, but a piece of high-value property, a living, breathing life support system. He made a sharp gesture with his free hand. Outside in the hallway, the heavy magnetic locks engaged with a series of dull, final thuds. The available light on the door's digital display flickered to a blood red, secured. Victoria looked at the locked doors, then down at the man on the bed. His chest rose and fell in a deep, rhythmic tandem with her own breathing. She realized then that the golden light hadn't just saved him. It had forged a shackle made of heartbeats. She wasn't just his nurse anymore. She was his heartbeat, and the guards at the door were no longer there to protect a patient. They were there to ensure their master's new lifeline never drew a breath outside these walls again. The transition from the sterile hospital ward to the Hoonjung estate happened under the cover of a moonless sky. A silent procession of black armored SUVs cutting through the Seoul outskirts like a funeral cortege. Victoria sat in the back of the lead vehicle, her hand forced to remain firmly against Hoonjung's chest as he lay across the leather bench seat. Every time the car hit a bump and her palm slipped even an inch, the portable heart monitor clipped to his belt let out a low, warning trill that made her blood run cold. When the massive iron gates of the estate finally hissed shut behind them, Victoria realized she wasn't entering a home. She was entering a fortress designed to disappear people. The gilded ward was a sprawling masterpiece of glass and obsidian, perched on a cliffside that overlooked the churning gray sea. "Carry him," the enforcer commanded as the doors opened. Two men lifted Hoonjung with practiced efficiency, but they moved in a tight, awkward formation to ensure Victoria remained pressed against his side, her feet nearly tripping over theirs as they navigated the marble foyer. They reached the master suite, a cavernous room dominated by a bed that looked more like a command center than a place of rest. Once Hoonjung was settled onto the silk sheets, the enforcer finally lowered his weapon, though his eyes remained as sharp as the blade tucked into his belt. He gestured to the room, which was stocked with every medical supply Victoria could ever need, alongside a wardrobe filled with clothes that were clearly not her own. "This is your world now," he said. "The staff will bring whatever you ask for, but the doors only open when I say so. You are the only thing keeping the chairman's heart beating. If you break, he breaks. If you run, he dies before you hit the gate. Do you understand your value?" Victoria didn't answer. She was staring at Hoonjung. His eyes were still closed, his long lashes casting shadows against his pale cheekbones. Now that the immediate chaos of the hospital had faded, she could see the terrifying beauty of the man she had resurrected. The fire in her hands had dimmed to a steady low-frequency hum, a tether that made her chest ache in perfect synchronization with his. Suddenly, the man on the bed shifted. A jagged, low groan escaped his throat, and his fingers twitched, brushing against the sleeve of Victoria's teal scrubs. His eyes blinked open, not with the confusion of a patient waking from surgery, but with the cold, piercing clarity of a king reclaiming his throne. He didn't look at the guards. He didn't look at the room. His gaze locked onto Victoria with a ferocity that made her breath catch. He reached up, his hand surprisingly strong as he covered hers, pressing it harder against his own heart. "You," he rasped, his voice a dark, vibrating chord that seemed to resonate directly in Victoria's bones. "I felt you in the dark, a flame I couldn't ignore." He sat up slowly, the motion forcing Victoria to lean in close, their faces inches apart. The dominance he radiated was suffocating, a physical weight that filled the vast room. He looked at the enforcer, then back at Victoria, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips. "The doctors said I was dead," Hoonjung murmured, his thumb tracing the pulse point on Victoria's wrist. "They said I was hollow. But you filled the void with fire." He leaned closer, his whisper cold and possessive. "The surgeons think you're a miracle. My men think you're a prisoner. But they're both wrong. You are my most vital organ, Victoria. And I never let anyone touch what belongs to me." The master suite was silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the medical equipment that monitored the invisible thread connecting Victoria to the man on the bed. Victoria knelt by Hoonjung's side, a basin of warm water and antiseptic resting on the nightstand. Her hands were steady, but her heart was still struggling to reconcile the divine focus she felt with the gritty reality of being a prisoner in a mansion made of secrets. Hoonjung sat back against the silk pillows, his shirt discarded. In the soft, amber light of the room, the intricate tattoos that covered his torso seemed to move with every shallow breath he took. They were a dark, swirling map of a life Victoria couldn't fathom. Dragons coiling around his ribs, lotus flowers blooming over old bullet wounds, and sharp, geometric patterns that felt like a warning in a forgotten language. "You're staring," Hoonjung murmured, his voice a low vibration that made the air between them feel thick. "I'm assessing the damage," Victoria replied clinically, though she knew it was a lie. She dipped a soft cloth into the water and began to clean the surgical site on his abdomen. As she worked, she noticed something that wasn't ink. Beneath the dragons were thin, white lines, scars that didn't come from gunshots or knives. They were old, jagged marks from a childhood that looked like it had been spent in a cage of a different kind. As her fingers brushed a particularly deep scar near his heart, a sudden violent spark ignited at the point of contact. It wasn't the warm, healing glow she was used to. It was a white-hot flash that jolted through her marrow. Suddenly, the luxury of the estate dissolved. Victoria wasn't in a bedroom. She was in a cold, damp basement. The smell of expensive lilies was replaced by the stench of mildew and fear. She saw a young boy, Hoonjung, huddled in a corner, his small back pressed against cold concrete. A man stood over him, his face a shadow, holding a heavy belt that whistled through the air. The boy didn't cry. He only stared with eyes that were already turning into the cold obsidian Victoria saw today. "No," Victoria gasped, her eyes snapping back to the present. She pulled her hand away, her breath coming in ragged hitches. The golden embers were still dancing on her fingertips, fading slowly into the air like dying stars. Hoonjung was staring at her, his expression a mix of shock and a vulnerability he clearly hated. The air in the room felt electrified, the sink between them pulsing with an intensity that made her ears ring. He grabbed her wrist, not with the violence of a captor, but with a desperate, searching grip. "What did you see?" he demanded, his voice cracking for the first time. Victoria looked at the scars, then back at his eyes. The monster she had resurrected was no longer just a headline or a Mafia CEO. He was the boy in the corner, and the fire in her hands had just bridged the gap between his trauma and her soul. "I saw why you stopped breathing long before your heart did," she whispered. Hoonjung didn't let go. He pulled her hand back to his chest, forcing her palm against the very scar that had triggered the vision. The heat returned, but this time it was steady and grounding. "Then you know," he said, his gaze dark and unyielding. "You saved a man who was raised to be a weapon. Don't expect me to know how to be anything else." The sanctuary of the estate's master suite felt thinner than usual, the morning light cutting through the glass with a clinical, unforgiving sharpness. Victoria was adjusting Hoonjung's fore-drip, her fingers brushing his arm to maintain the steady, golden hum of the sink, when the enforcer burst in. His face, usually a mask of stone, was tight with a suppressed fury. "It's out," he said, slamming a tablet onto the obsidian table. The hospital staff couldn't keep their mouths shut. "The dark web is screaming about the miracle nurse who raises the dead. You're no longer a secret, Victoria. You're a target." Victoria felt a cold rush of nausea. She looked at the screen, seeing a grainy, blurred image of herself entering the VIP ward. The headline in the encrypted forum translated to the eternal lifeline: "Possession is power." Before she could speak, a distant, muffled explosion rocked the foundations of the house. The security monitors in the room flickered. On the screen, a group of men in tactical gear, bearing the red-eye sigil of the rival Bexa syndicate, were breaching the perimeter. They weren't there to kill Hoonjung. They were moving with a surgical, terrifying precision toward the master wing. "Stay behind me," Hoonjung commanded, his voice dropping into that lethal, predatory register. He tore the four from his arm, his heart rate monitor spiking as he stood. Victoria felt his panic through the bond, a sharp, electric jolt that made her own chest tighten. The bedroom doors hissed open, and a single man stepped through. He wasn't dressed for a war. He was dressed in a simple gray suit, looking more like an accountant than a killer. But in his hand, he held a young guard by the throat, the boy's face turning purple. "They say you can fix anything," the assassin said, his voice devoid of emotion. He threw the dying guard at Victoria's feet. The boy's neck was crushed, his breathing a wet, desperate rattle. "Prove it. Heal him, and my masters might let you live as our guest. Fail, and we'll see if your own heart can survive being carved out of your chest." Victoria looked down at the boy. Her nurse instincts screamed at her to kneel, to let the fire in her hands mend the shattered windpipe. But Hoonjung's hand clamped onto her shoulder, his grip bruising. "Don't touch him," Hoonjung hissed. "It's a trap. They want to see how the power works. They want to measure the light." "He's dying," Victoria cried, the golden embers already beginning to swirl around her fingertips. The air in the room grew hot, the supernatural energy reacting to the proximity of death. The assassin smiled, a cold, empty expression, and raised a silenced pistol, aiming it not at Hoonjung, but at Victoria's head. "The clock is ticking, healer. Does the fire work for everyone, or only for your king?" Victoria looked from the dying boy to the man who owned her heartbeat. She realized with a sickening clarity that the miracle she had performed in the hospital had painted a bullseye on her soul. She wasn't a woman anymore. She was a resource. The price of her miracle was a world that would now break every life around her just to see if she could put the pieces back together. The boy's rattle stopped. Silence filled the room, heavy and expectant. Victoria's hands glowed brighter, the golden light reflecting in the assassin's hungry eyes. She realized that if she touched the guard, she was confirming her status as a weapon. If she didn't, she was letting a soul slip away. The fire burned, demanding a choice that would either cement her humanity or turn her into the underworld's greatest prize. The enforcer's warning about the miracle nurse had been more than a security alert. It was the prologue to a biological nightmare Victoria never saw coming. 2 weeks into her captivity at the estate, Hoonjung decided to test the limits of their tether. A high-level meeting with the Japanese syndicate required his presence in the city, and despite the doctor's frantic warnings about the sink, Hoonjung's arrogance, or perhaps his need for control, won out. He left at dawn, leaving Victoria behind in the gilded ward under a heavy guard, convinced that a few miles of Seoul asphalt couldn't sever what her blood had forged. For the first hour, Victoria felt only a dull, nagging ache in the center of her chest, like a distant storm front moving in. She tried to distract herself by organizing the medical supplies, but as the clock ticked toward the second hour, the ache sharpened into a rhythmic stabbing. It wasn't just pain, it was a void. Her heartbeat felt hollow, as if it were echoing in a cavern that was slowly collapsing. Across the city, in a high-rise boardroom made of glass and steel, Hoonjung felt the first tremor. He was mid-sentence, outlining a trade route, when the air suddenly fled his lungs. His vision blurred, the faces of the other CEOs dissolving into smeared ink. He clutched the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles white, as his heart began to skip beats like a broken clock. Back at the estate, Victoria collapsed onto the marble floor of the master suite. The golden embers that usually danced around her fingertips were flickering out, turning into a cold, ashen gray. She clawed at her throat, her lungs burning as if she were breathing water. The sink was no longer a hum. It was a frantic, dying scream. She could feel Hoonjung's panic through the bond, a jagged, agonizing pulse that told her his heart was slowing to a crawl. "He's too far," she wheezed as the enforcer burst into the room. He didn't need to ask. The portable monitor on Victoria's bedside table was screaming, showing her own vitals plummeting in perfect synchronization with the chairman's distant struggle. Hoonjung didn't finish the meeting. He didn't even say goodbye. He stumbled out of the boardroom, his guards practically carrying his limp body to the elevator. In the back of the armored SUV, he drifted in and out of consciousness, his chest heaving. The distance between them was a physical poison, a biological rejection of the space he had tried to claim. The SUV tore through the gates of the estate just as Victoria's vision was fading to black. Her heart gave one last, shuddering thrum and then stopped. In that same second 2 miles away, Hoonjung's pulse flatlined. The car screeched to a halt at the front entrance. The guards dragged Hoonjung toward the master wing, his boots scuffing against the marble. They threw the doors open and heaved him onto the floor beside the unconscious Victoria. The moment their skin touched, his hand falling across her shoulder, the world exploded in a violent burst of gold. A surge of supernatural heat jolted through both of them like a lightning strike. Victoria's eyes flew open, her lungs drawing in a massive ragged breath as her heart leaped back into a frantic, healthy rhythm. Hoonjung gasped, his eyes snapping open to meet hers, his chest heaving in perfect tandem with hers. They lay there on the cold floor, tangled together, gasping for air as the sink stabilized into a deep, vibrating roar. Victoria looked at him, her terror replaced by a grim realization. They weren't just connected, they were a single organism. The distance hadn't just been a test, it had been an execution. As Hoonjung gripped her hand, his pulse finally steadying against her palm, she realized that neither of them would ever truly draw a breath alone again. The following days at the estate were thick with an unsettling, electric tension. The sink crisis had proven that Victoria was no longer a bystander in Hoonjung's life. She was his foundation. But as she sat in the library, her fingers tracing the edge of an ancient medical text, the golden hum beneath her skin felt different, restless, as if the fire she had used to ignite his heart was beginning to develop a mind of its own. Hoonjung entered the room, his movements now fluid and predatory once more. Behind him followed a man Victoria recognized as one of his high-level lieutenants, a man named Minho who had always greeted her with a polite, deferential bow. "The shipment from the docks was intercepted," Minho said, his voice steady. "The Japanese syndicate knew exactly where our blind spots were. We have a leak in the security team, Chairman. I've already begun the interrogations." Victoria looked up, and as Minho spoke, her right hand began to throb with a sudden, searing heat. It wasn't the warm, life-giving glow she felt during the sink. This was a jagged, abrasive vibration. She looked at her palm and saw faint, orange embers flickering like a warning light. Hoonjung noticed her wince. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his eyes searching hers. "Victoria, is the heart link spiking?" "No," she whispered, her gaze drifting to Minho. As she focused on the lieutenant, the fire in her hand roared. It felt like a physical pressure against her skull, a low-frequency hum that translated into a single, undeniable truth. When Minho looked at Hoonjung, the nurse in her didn't see loyalty. The fire in her saw a web of jagged black deceit. "He's lying," Victoria said, the words slipping out before she could check her fear. The room went deathly silent. Minho stiffened, his hand hovering near his jacket. "Excuse me, Nurse John. I've served the chairman for 10 years. Hoonjung didn't look at his lieutenant. He stared at Victoria's hand, which was now radiating a fierce, pulsating light. "How do you know?" I can feel it," Victoria said, standing up. As she moved closer to Minho, the embers on her fingertips grew brighter, turning a deep, angry crimson. "It's not just healing. The light. It reacts to truth. When you speak, the air around you stays clear. But when he speaks, it feels like I'm touching a live wire. He's the leak, Hoonjung. He knows exactly where the shipment is." Minho's face contorted, the mask of the loyal servant shattering into a snarl of desperation. He reached for his weapon, but Victoria's divine focus snapped into place before he could draw. She didn't think, she simply reached out and caught his wrist. The moment her supernatural hand made contact, a shockwave of golden energy blasted through the room. It wasn't a healing touch. It was a perception of danger so intense it manifested as a physical force. Minho let out a strangled cry as the fire torched through his deception, his own nervous system momentarily overloaded by the purity of her power. He collapsed to his knees, his gun clattering across the marble. Hoonjung stepped over the fallen man, his gaze fixed on Victoria with a new, terrifying level of awe. He took her hand in his, and for a moment, the red embers of danger blended with the golden glow of their sink, turning into a brilliant, blinding white. "The doctors called it a medical miracle," Hoon-jung murmured, his thumb tracing the glowing lines on her palm. "But they were wrong. You're not just my lifeline, Victoria. You're my oracle." Victoria pulled her hand back, the heat fading into a dull ache. She looked at the man on the floor, then back at the monster who owned her heartbeat. She realized then that the fire wasn't just a tool for survival. It was a sensory evolution. She could sense the darkness in men's souls before they even moved. But as Hoon-jung smiled, a cold, satisfied expression, she realized the true danger. She had just given the most dangerous man in Korea a weapon that could see through walls and souls alike. The aftermath of Min-ho's betrayal left the library smelling of ozone and impending death. Hoon-jung's retaliation had been swift and absolute. The traitor lay silent on the marble floor, but the violence had taken its toll on the chairman. The physical exertion of the struggle, combined with the raw surge of supernatural energy Victoria had unleashed, had pushed Hoon-jung's fragile, synced heart to its breaking point. He slumped back against a mahogany desk, his face a ghostly white, his hand clutching his chest as his breathing became a series of shallow, jagged rasps. "Fix it," he groaned, his eyes fixed on Victoria. "The fire. Give me the fire." Victoria stood her ground, her teal scrubs trembling but her gaze unyielding. The orange embers of her new sensory power were still dancing along her knuckles, but they were now tinged with a deep, mournful violet. For the first time, she didn't move toward him. She didn't reach out to mend the damage. "No," she said, the single word echoing through the vast room. Outside in the hall, Hoon-jung's guards had pinned another man to the ground, a young lookout who had unwittingly helped Min-ho bypass the gates. The boy was barely 20, his face wet with tears as he begged for his life. Victoria could feel the boy's terror through the air. It felt like a cold wind against her skin. "Kill the boy," Hoon-jung wheezed, gesturing to the guards. "He failed. He let the poison in. In my world, failure is a capital offense. If he dies, I stop," Victoria said, stepping back into the shadows of the bookshelves. She could feel Hoon-jung's heart skipping beats, a frantic hollow drumming that mirrored her own growing distance. "Your heart only beats because I allow it to. You want my fire. You want to live to see tomorrow. Then you will show him the mercy you claim doesn't exist." Hoon-jung's eyes flared with a lethal, black anger. He tried to stand, to dominate her with his height and his history of violence, but his knees buckled. He was a king who owned the city, but he was a man who couldn't draw a breath without the woman he had imprisoned. The sink was no longer a tether. It was a leverage point. "You're bargaining with a monster," Hoon-jung rasped, blood beginning to fleck his lips. "I'm setting the price for my soul," Victoria replied. The violet light on her hands grew brighter, reflecting in the obsidian of his eyes. "I saved you from the dark, Hoon-jung. I won't let you drag me into it. Let the boy go, or we both stop breathing here together." The silence in the library was agonizing, a vacuum where the power of the underworld met the purity of a healer's will. Hoon-jung stared at her, searching for a crack in her divine focus, but he found only a wall of fire. He looked toward the door, his chest heaving in a desperate, losing battle for air. "Let him go," Hoon-jung finally choked out, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. The guards hesitated, then released the boy, who scrambled away into the night. The moment the threat was gone, Victoria moved. She crossed the room in a blur of motion, her hands erupting in a brilliant restorative gold. She slammed her palm against Hoon-jung's heart, and the sink roared back to life, a tidal wave of supernatural heat that flooded his system and forced his pulse back into a steady rhythmic march. Hoon-jung gasped, his lungs expanding as the fire torched away the shadows of his collapse. He gripped Victoria's wrists, pulling her close until their foreheads touched. He was alive, but the world had changed. He looked at her not just as his lifeline, but as his commander. For the first time since the hospital, the Mafia CEO realized he wasn't the only one in the room with the power to take a life. Victoria had just shifted the weight of the crown, and the monster had no choice but to bow to his savior's terms. The news of the miracle healer had spread through the underworld like a contagion, turning Victoria from a woman into the ultimate commodity. The rival Bexa syndicate didn't want Hoonjung dead anymore. They wanted the engine that kept him running. The breach happened during the shift change, a calculated explosion of flashbangs and sleeping gas that tore through the estate's high-security perimeter. Victoria felt the sink scream in warning, a jagged electrical fire in her marrow, but before she could reach Hoonjung, a heavy, chemically dampened cloth was pressed over her mouth. The last thing she felt was the tether snapping, a hollow, agonizing void opening in her chest as she was dragged into the dark. She awoke in a location that smelled of cold sea salt and expensive cigars. She was strapped to a chair in the center of a literal stage, surrounded by the silhouettes of men in shadows. This was the underworld auction, a gathering of the city's most depraved power brokers. "Gentlemen," a voice rasped from the balcony, belonging to the leader of the Bexa. "We offer you more than territory today. We offer you the nurse of eternal light. With her touch, death is merely a suggestion." Victoria's breath was shallow, her lungs burning. The distance from Hoonjung was already poisoning her. Every second away from him felt like her heart was trying to beat through a wall of broken glass. But through the haze of her own failing vitals, she felt him. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical vibration. Somewhere in the city, Hoonjung was dying. His heart flatlining as the distance grew, but he was moving. He was a dying star dragging himself toward his center. The heavy steel doors of the warehouse didn't just open. They were vaporized by a thermal charge. The enforcers of the Hoonjung Empire poured in, but at their head was the chairman himself. He looked like a ghost, his skin gray, his eyes bloodshot, his hand clutching his chest as he stumbled forward. He was a man who should have been in a coma, yet he was upright, driven by a lethal, supernatural obsession that defied medical logic. "She is not for sale," Hoonjung wheezed, his voice a ragged snarl that echoed through the vaulted ceiling. He didn't wait for a counteroffer. He opened fire, his movements jerky and uncoordinated as his heart skipped beats, but his aim was guided by the invisible cord pulling him toward Victoria. The auction floor descended into a bloodbath. Hoonjung moved through the crossfire like a man already dead, ignoring the bullets that grazed his shoulders, his gaze fixed solely on the woman in the chair. He reached her just as his knees finally gave out. He collapsed at her feet, his head thumping against her knees. Victoria leaned forward as much as her restraints allowed, pressing her forehead against his. The moment they touched, the warehouse was illuminated by a blinding white-hot explosion of gold. The sink roared back to life with the force of a tidal wave. The golden embers didn't just heal, they radiated outward in a protective shockwave that sent the remaining kidnappers reeling. Victoria felt his pulse jump under her skin, a frantic, desperate rhythm that stabilized the moment their breaths mingled. Hoonjung looked up, his face regaining its porcelain clarity, his eyes dark with a terrifying, absolute devotion. He had risked his entire empire, his territory, and his very last breath to find her. As he began to untie her, Victoria realized the truth. The world thought she was the one saving him, but in the heart of the fire, they were both burning together. The fire in the warehouse had begun to cool, but the atmosphere remained charged with a heavy, electric residue of the sink. Victoria sat on the floor, her back against a rusted shipping container, with Hoonjung's head resting in her lap. His breathing was deep and rhythmic now, his heart drawing its strength from the golden warmth pulsing through her legs and into his spirit. Around them, the silence of the aftermath was absolute. The rival syndicate had been scattered, and the empire had been held together by nothing more than a shared heartbeat. Hoonjung looked up at her, his dark eyes no longer reflecting the cold obsidian of a predator, but the shimmering, vulnerable gold of a man who had seen the bottom of the abyss. He reached up to touch her face, his fingers trembling. "The estate is secure," he whispered, his voice a gravelly ghost of its former authority. "We go back now. I'll double the guard. No one will ever touch you again." Victoria didn't move. She didn't offer the comforting glow he was searching for. Instead, she looked at the heavy magnetic cuffs that had been cut from her wrists, lying discarded in the dirt. The orange embers of her perception power flickered to life, dancing across her knuckles with a new, steady intensity. She saw the future he was offering, a more comfortable cage, a higher wall, a deeper isolation. "No," she said, her voice echoing with a finality that made the air hum. Hoonjung stiffened, his pulse spiking against her palm. "Victoria, you saw what they did. You are a target. You are the only thing that keeps me alive. And you are the only thing that makes me a prisoner," Victoria countered, her gaze unblinking. She leaned down, her face inches from his, the divine focus radiating from her like a physical heat. "I saved you in that hospital because it was my duty. I saved you in this warehouse because I chose to. But the lifeline is finished, Hoonjung. I am not a medical miracle to be stored in a vault, and I am not a weapon to be used by the underworld." She stood up, forcing him to find his own balance. The golden light between them stretched but did not snap, a glowing tether that hummed with a different frequency, one of mutual respect rather than forced possession. "From this moment, the rules of this house change," Victoria declared. The fire in her hands flared into a brilliant white gold, casting long, regal shadows against the warehouse walls. "I will work at the hospital. I will walk the streets of Seoul. And your men will not be my guards. They will be my messengers. You want to live? Then you will rule this city with the mercy I taught you. You will be the shield for the weak, or I will let the fire go cold." Hoonjung stood slowly, his breath hitching as he felt the shift in the bond. He looked at his hands, then at the woman who had redefined the very meaning of power. He was the most feared man in the East, yet he realized he was standing in the presence of a queen whose crown was forged in the sun. "You would risk everything for a world that doesn't understand you?" he asked, a trace of awe coloring his words. "I've already risked everything to save a monster," she replied, a soft, determined smile touching her lips. "I think I can handle the rest." She held out her hand, not as a nurse offering a treatment, but as an equal offering a pact. Hoonjung took it, and the sink stabilized into a deep, harmonious roar. The healer's reign had begun. Victoria was no longer the girl who had taken a shortcut through the dark. She was the light that the dark now answered to. As they walked out of the warehouse together, the morning sun rose over Incheon, reflecting off the gold in her eyes and the steady, borrowed rhythm of his heart. They were no longer prisoner and captor. They were two souls bound by a flame that could either burn the world down or finally, mercifully, light it up.